Welcome, dear learners. This lecture is dealing with myth and story. We are going to deal with the topic of myth and story in detail. Narrative, synonymous with story, from the Latin term for relate, which also characterizes the act of storytelling. When we narrate, we convert an experience into a spoken or written account. By aligning a verbal sequence of statements with a purported sequence of events, we recapitulate the experience. Preserving the chronological order of events is fundamental to our understanding of a story. Rather than being a mere collection of sentences or clauses, a story is conceived as a unified entity. Nonetheless, once we recognize their interconnectedness, these sentences undergo a transformation into potent cognitive and emotional constructs. This transformation can only be achieved by considering the narrative's sequence. The narrative's ability to captivate the mind and evoke emotions greatly relies on the skill and artistry of the storyteller. A proficient narrator has the capacity to completely engage the audience, influencing their thoughts, emotions, and potentially even their future actions. Now we will look to the narratives. The question of what defines a story introduces a slightly different perspective. Generally, narratives are understood as stories that primarily circulate through oral tradition and are shared face to face, since they are transmitted orally rather than in written form. These narratives tend to exhibit certain characteristics. Narratives typically exist in multiple versions. No single text can claim to be the authoritative or definitive version. Instead, different storytellers perform the narratives in diverse ways depending on the circumstances. In other words, a narrative must be recreated with each telling. Due to this process of recreation, narratives reflect both the past and the present. Narrators draw upon past language, symbols, events, and forms that they share with their audience to ensure comprehension and meaning. However, because each narration is a product of the moment, it also incorporates contemporary situations and concerns reflecting current values and attitudes. A story can be seen as a bridge between the past and the present, allowing the past to resonate in the present. A story encompasses both the individual and the community. The narrator shapes the narratives they recreate according to their own perspectives and circumstances. It is important to note that narration is not exclusive to primitive or peasant groups, but is present in all human societies, including our own. Sociologists have categorized narratives into various subtypes and often possess a broad vocabulary to describe them, including terms such as origin myth, legend, memorate, etiological tale, magic tale, joke, personal experience story, and life history, among others. The use of terminology in this context can often create more confusion than clarity, but it does reflect some distinctions that sociologists consider significant within the broader realm of narratives. Three main categories are regularly differentiated when it comes to prose narratives, which is myth, legend, and tale. However, these terms primarily describe the attitudes of the community towards the narrative rather than their specific forms. For instance, a myth is a narrative that is generally perceived by the community in which it is told as both sacred and true. As a result, myths tend to be fundamental narratives within larger ideological systems. They explore ultimate realities and are often set outside of historical time, describing events that occurred before the world took its present form. They frequently involve the actions of divine or semi-divine characters, and through these characters, the world has evolved into its current state. It's important to note that the definition of myth does not imply that it is considered false. Rather, its ultimate truthfulness in the eyes of someone allows it to be categorized as a myth. Myths are often performed in ritual or ceremonial contexts with specific individuals designated to recite them. The manner and timing of the performance may also differentiate myths from other narrative forms within a society. In fact, the language used in a myth can be as sacred as its message. On the other hand, a tale is a narrative that is recognized and received as fiction or fantasy. Unlike myths, these narratives are not considered sacred, nor do they challenge the audience worldview in the same way as legends. Tales can take various forms and are seldom found within the oral traditions of our own society. However, many have been adapted for children's entertainment and can be found in numerous illustrated books and films. The collection of German folk tales compiled by Wilhelm Grimm and Jacob Grimm in the early 19th century is one of the most popular sources for children's literature. While the Grimms initially heard these tales performed orally, they also edited them in their famous collection. The points discussed regarding narratives have several implications. Firstly, it should be noted that narratives are not necessarily ancient or very old, they are an ongoing process. While many narratives today can be traced back to long-standing traditions that have developed over centuries. There are also narratives that appear contemporary without deep historical roots. Simply examining the narrative itself is insufficient to determine its age or historical lineage. Narratives that seem modern in their settings and details may be part of an older narrative tradition. Establishing the lineage of a specific narrative requires comprehensive historical research. Moreover, the age or novelty of a narrative cannot be determined solely by analyzing the text. Old narratives can be presented in a modern form, while recently created narratives may carry an aura of venerable age. Secondly, it's important to recognize that narrative does not necessarily embody all that is good, beautiful, or noble in the world. Narratives reflect the societies and individuals who create and transmit them, encompassing a wide range of human ideas and emotions. It is crucial to understand that narratives do not solely document tales of triumph over evil, acts of sacrifice, martyrdom, or virtuous deeds that lead to supernatural rewards. While such stories do exist, it's important to acknowledge that narratives also depict themes of violence, hatred, cruelty, racism, and prejudice. Those who selectively study and examine narrative based on specific themes are not genuinely interested in understanding narrative as an expression of the human condition. Instead, they seek to justify, rationalize, or exemplify a pre-existing philosophy or worldview. Their primary objective is not to learn about the world, but rather to confirm their existing beliefs. It should be noted that narrative have indeed been used in this manner in the past and will likely continue to be used as such in the future. In our society, we often look back with fondness on the stories we read or were told as children. The pleasure we experienced from this limited collection of tales possibly enhanced by the special attention our parents gave us when they read or narrated them, leads us to believe that narratives are especially suitable for children. However, most research conducted on narrative in our own society and others suggests that this assumption is not accurate. Now we will move to the part of myth. The term myth originates from the Greek word mythos, which means speech or story. A myth is a reverent narrative that mirrors and strengthens a community's worldview. Myths serve to elucidate the essential aspects of human existence, addressing questions about the origins of everything we know, the purpose of our existence, our destiny, and even our existential significance. It is crucial to note that when the term myth is used, it does not imply falsehood, but rather indicates the sacred nature of the narrative. Malinowski suggests that we turn to our sacred stories as moral guides for our behavior. By contemplating the various stories we tell, we shape our understanding of what constitutes good and bad conduct. Myth has also functioned in a society as cultural practices, values and ethical codes, hierarchy of humans and animals, humanity's relationship with gods, relationship between humans and nature, myth, legend and tale. The subsequent point revolves around the discussion of distinguishing between myth, legend and tale. Sociologists primarily base their categorization of these forms of narrative on the perception and attitudes of the individuals who share them. If people consider the narrative to be sacred, it is classified as myth. If they view it as a potentially accurate account of real events, it is labeled as a legend. And if they regard it as a complete work of fiction requiring suspension of disbelief, it falls under the category of tale. The key focus for the sociologist is understanding in the role of narrative within a broader framework of beliefs and behaviors. They acknowledge that narratives are produced by individuals during social interactions and are influenced by surrounding cultural traditions. The concept of folktale extends beyond the familiar once upon a time and happily ever after. A tale encompasses a much broader scope. Our task is to comprehend why people engage in storytelling, why listeners find stories appealing, and why certain stories are preferred over the others. The challenge lies not only in understanding how a narrative is structured, but also in comprehending why a specific individual or group finds that narrative meaningful, worthy of attention, and deserving of retelling. To answer such questions, a holistic study of narrative is required. The sociologist must explore the narrative's structure or organization, uncover its explicit and implicit meanings to those who share it, and examine the functions of storytelling within the community's life. This examination of structures, meanings, and functions necessitates an examination of how narratives relate to larger contexts. Four major contexts regularly serve as the foundations for understanding story, that is cultural context, social context, individual context, and comparative context. Stories are enacted within particular social settings. These settings are defined by a specific group of individuals, a specific set of principles that govern their relationships, specific behaviors and conversations in which the story is embedded, and a specific physical and symbolic environment present during the act of storytelling. Understanding a story is influenced to some degree by comprehending the particular situation or situations in which it is shared. There is also a comparative context in which stories can be analyzed and interpreted. This context is distinct from the previously mentioned context because it does not directly relate to the immediate performance of the story. The comparative context pertains to the broader realm of story that extends beyond the immediate performance situation, and it may even transcend and bounds of a specific society and culture. Nonetheless, this context can contribute to the analysis and interpretation of any given narrative. Sociologists compare tales with other tales in order to unravel elements of their historical development, structure, and symbolism. A comparative perspective offers various ways to contribute to the interpretation and comprehension of stories. Sir James George Fraser observed a particular aspect in the study of stories. It becomes evident that examining stories comparatively within the frame of global narratives inevitably changes perspectives and opens possibilities for interpretive commentaries that cannot be attained solely through the exploration of cultural, social, and individual contexts. In truth, when a sociologist approaches the interpretation of a story that rarely confine themselves to just one of the four interpretive contexts described earlier, typically the approach to the narrative is multifaceted as these contexts inform and interact with one another. There is no distinct separation between the individual and the social and the cultural, or the cultural and the comparative contexts. They all seamlessly blend into each other. It would be naive to believe that a comprehensive understanding of storytelling could be achieved by solely examining one of these contexts. Stories have been closely examined since the time of the brothers Grimm. Yet, as societies evolve, the types of narratives that hold prominence also change. Previous emphasis on myths and tales is now shifting towards jokes, legends, and personal experience stories. These are the stories that often permeate our everyday conversations, certainly passing by without much notice. Nevertheless, these shifts in focus and emphasis do not diminish the enduring enigmas of storytelling. Unraveling the intricacies of how and what stories convey will continue to captivate sociologists for generations to come. Discourses on myth. The distinction between story and myth lies in their definitions. A story refers to a series of events, whether real or fictional, and can be a narrative of such events. On the other hand, a myth is a traditional story that embodies a belief about a fact or experience, often personifying natural and spiritual forces. Myths are considered sacred narratives and are believed to be true. They often revolve around the origins of the world, a people, or feature gods and heroes. Scholars have long been intrigued and puzzled by the definitions and analysis of myths. Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, renowned for their collections of fairy tales, sought to demonstrate that the story of a specific people, particularly German national character, embodied myth, folktale, and legend. Similar categorizations have been made by scholars from various parts of the world. Austrian analytical psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, active in the late 19th and early 20th century, proposed that myths emerged from the collective unconscious, a shared aspect of the human mind. According to Jung, myths contain common archetypes, deeply embedded patterns recognized on a mental level, akin to the way instincts operate in psychological processes. He argued that these archetypes account for the similarities found in mythic stories and events across different cultures and time periods. Max Miller, a scholar who worked in Great Britain during the 19th century, held the belief that myths served as metaphors for natural processes. As a Sanskrit scholar and comparative philologist, Muller viewed the mythology of his time in England as remnants of an assumed Orient past, which he believed could be unraveled through linguistic comparisons starting with Sanskrit. He observed resemblances in the metaphorical names of ancient gods across civilizations from India to Greece to Rome. Muller argued that myths were encoded metaphoric mnemonics that represented not only the actions of gods but also the natural processes of the world, particularly the movements of the sun. According to his theory, myths emerged when people possessed the ability to reason but lacked abstract thinking. He proposed that both individual worlds and specific gods could symbolize natural phenomena such as the sun's daily and early journey. Over time, the original meanings of myths were lost and they became entities. Muller believed that only scholarly comparative linguistic analysis could unravel the mysteries of which gods corresponded to which natural events. Franz Boas, credited with establishing the study of anthropology and mythology in the United States, viewed all stories as reflections of culture, encompassing both permissible and forbidden aspects. In 1916, Boas explicitly stated that the cognitive processes leading primitive individuals to create myths were the same processes employed by modern humans. His perspective anticipated arguments put forth by Claude Lévi-Strauss 3 decades later. In 1965, William Bascom put forward a proposed solution to the problem of defining myth. His definition not only became the basis for accepting a narrative as myth, but also served as a starting point to challenge the classification of myth. Bascom aimed to establish analytical constructs for myth, legend, and folktale that would be valid across cultures. According to Bascom, myth is a type of prose narrative that is believed to be true by the members of the society in which the myth originates. He noted that myths typically revolve around events from a distant past set in a world that is different from or earlier than the present reality. Myths often possess a sacred element even if they are not entirely regarded as sacred and prominently feature non-human characters. Bascom also emphasized that although there are fewer myths compared to folk tales or legends within a given culture, myths hold significant importance as they are considered sacred and provide the basis for existence and cultural practices. Additionally, myths serve explanatory and etiological functions, offering explanations for natural or cultural phenomena. In Bascom's examinations of societies and cultures worldwide, he observed that it was often challenging to utilize the work of ethnographers on myths or narratives because they did not provide sufficient information on the beliefs held by the originating group. Therefore, the issue of belief was crucial for Bascom. He acknowledged that in certain cultures, the categories of myth, legend, and folktale might be blurred. However, since his definition was part of an analytical framework imposed from outside the culture, the native categories used by the people themselves were not deemed significant for the purpose of analysis and comparisons by external observers. Delheims and Dennis Tedlock are recognized for their contributions in making the poetic structure present not only in myths but also in other narrative forms. They emphasized the importance of presenting these narratives in their spoken form rather than rendering them in prose, as doing so diminishes their poetic structure and impact. Their work highlights the need for careful typesetting and reading techniques to help readers appreciate the spoken word's quality compared to the written form. A definition of myth that holds true across cultures and is minimal yet culturally inclusive is that it represents a sacred narrative widely believed to be true. Due to its sacred nature, many individuals object to labeling their own sacred narratives as myths. For those within culture where the myth is embedded, the understanding of its truth may vary between literal and figurative interpretations. Literalists perceive myths as completely true, while the figuratives view them as metaphorically expressions. Joseph Campbell, a mesmerizing speaker, skillfully harnessed the power of words. Throughout the 1980s, he was widely recognized as a prominent figure associated with myth in popular consciousness. Campbell possessed not only the ability to captivate his audience with his speeches, but also to engage them through his compelling storytelling, whether in lectures or on television. In his approach to myths and the study of mythology, Campbell adapted a universalist perspective. He shared a similar viewpoint with psychologist Jung, asserting that myths contain similar stories across diverse cultures and that they are essentially retellings of one another. To support his claims, Campbell gathered data from fragments of myths extracted from various narrative traditions, often taken out of their original context. Now we will slowly move to the idea of structure and myth. Claude Lévi-Strauss, a renowned French scholar, is widely regarded as one of the most prominent academic authorities on world mythology. While his research primarily focuses on Native American sources across the Americas, Lévi-Strauss has primarily communicated his findings through written works rather than visual media. Despite the absence of contextualization in his approach, Lévi-Strauss argues that all myths, regardless of their origin, possess a common structure that he has distilled into an algebraic formula. Additionally, he asserts that myths are binary structures, creating a resolving contrasts and contradictions within a culture and society. According to Lévi-Strauss, the universalist perspective is valid because all individuals worldwide share a common brain structure which he believes is mirrored in myths. Consequently, myths serve as both a means of intellectual exploration and a reflection of the thought process themselves. Alan Dundes has dedicated a significant effort to analyzing and explaining myths. Unlike the universalist approach adapted by some scholars, Dundes employs a new Freudian framework for his analysis. He argues that myths, which he believes are products of adult minds, serve as one of the adult projective systems. Therefore, they have a universal nature, as adults worldwide utilize projective techniques often expressed through myths, while followers of Jung argued that archetypes are consistent across cultures. Proponents of the Freudian analysis of myth contend that the symbols found in myths are culturally influenced but still represent projections of infantile and child socialization systems. Many scholars who do not subscribe to Freudian theories express astonishment at how frequently Neo-Freudians, including Dundes, associate the myths they study with sexual Oedipus or Electra complexes. Furthermore, researchers have examined the connections between symbols, myths and rituals, as well as heroes and myths. Additionally, the syntagmatic and paradigmatic aspects of myth have garnered scholarly interest. In the later stage of his career, the late British social anthropologist Edmund Leach shifted his focus to examining Christian and Jewish myths. By utilizing biblical myths, he highlighted the repetitive nature of myth, asserting that the various episodes within a myth serve to reinforce the same essential message or messages. Some consider his work to be both an encapsulation and an expansion of the ideas put forth by Levi-Strauss. Although Leach did not claim universality for myth in general, however, it was his earlier contribution that had a greater impact on myth scholars. In those works, he demonstrated the fluidity of myth, challenging the notion that it remains fixed and unchanging over time. Leach discussed how myths and genealogies could be manipulated to support claims or resolve political matters. The permeability of myth, in fact, is one of its essential characteristics. If myth were to remain immutable once constructed, it would lose its value since it would be unable to accommodate cultural changes or advancements in society's knowledge. Myths lend itself to reinterpretation and can incorporate both the new and the traditional, particularly in societies where myths are kept alive through oral tradition and are not rigidly fixed in written form. Although myth holds greater potential for sociological exploration, few sociologists have spoken on the challenge of studying its processes. Durkheim made initial strides in developing a sociological concept of myth. For contemporary sociologists interested in investigating a sociological understanding of myth, one potential direction could be exploring the work of Roland Barthes. Barthes uses the narrative of myth making to elucidate the process of making sense of everyday lives and experiences. Furthermore, although they may not explicitly employ the term myth, Holstein and Gubrium describe a narrative self that relies on reflexive storytelling deeply embedded in social context to provide temporal structure and continuity. Dear learners, we have so far dealt with the idea of myth and story, like their structure and their origin and its storytelling processes. I hope you might have enjoyed this session. We will meet with another schedule. Thank you and all the best.